In this lecture, I'll be covering Working with Words, Chapters 7 and 8, the section on phrases, clauses, and sentences. Since some people will be using different versions or different editions of the books, in the book that I'm using, Chapter 7 has the phrases, clauses, and sentences, and Chapter 8 has subjects and objects. But of course, you'll want to make sure that when you are looking at yours, that the title matches, even if the chapter doesn't. I also will have a reminder for your vocabulary and spelling words as we look towards Quiz 2. So first I want to start off by talking about phrases. And phrases are groups of related words that lack either a subject, so this is the doer, or a verb, that's the action or state of being, or possibly both. They are parts of sentences, but they are not the whole sentence. So some examples are to the restaurant, walking along the beach, as long as his arms. But we can tell that these are not complete thoughts. And so phrases are not complete thoughts because they don't have the subject, the verb, or both. Clauses, on the other hand, are groups of related words that have both a subject and a verb. He wants it all. We have an independent clause that forms a complete thought independently and can also work as a sentence. Because he wants it all, this is a dependent clause because it is not a complete thought. It depends on something else for it to be a statement. So this is often when we add that additional word like because or but. Sentences, like clauses, are groups of related words with both a subject and a verb. But in addition, sentences must make a complete statement. We often call everything sentences, but the reality is not everything are sentences. Sentences have at least one independent clause and may have any number of dependent clauses. He loves to watch television to relax. He loves to watch television to relax, but he sometimes regrets doing that. Here we have two independent clauses joined by a comma and a coordinating conjunction, which is the word but. He loves to watch television to relax, even if he stays up later than he should. Here we have one independent clause and one dependent clause. These should all be very familiar to you, especially sentences, but just in case they're not, you may be asked at some point on a quiz, for example, to tell the difference between or to describe the differences between sentences, clauses, and phrases. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with their different elements and what makes each of these distinct. A common sentence errors include fragments, fused sentences, comma splice sentences, and run-on sentence. I'm going to describe each of these in the following slides. First are fragments, a word or group of words that isn't a complete sentence because it typically lacks a subject or verb, or it's a dependent clause. There's a lot of discussion about this, but people often wonder if fragments are bad. And the reality is they're not always bad. They can be used for emphasis in writing, to create movement or a tempo to a story, to answer a question, or they can be used as a transition. They are typically used for emphasis though, or tempo. They're used more often in creative writing, which is not what we're doing, of course, in journalism, but they're also used often from a journalistic standpoint in feature writing. Examples of fragments: a tire for all seasons, takes the guesswork out of the game because he was sick. Fused sentences. A fused sentence unacceptably combines two or more independent clauses without putting punctuation between them. This is very common. The mayor left town, the auditor did too. So we have an issue here because there are two independent clauses that have been shoved together, and so we have to change it. The first way we can change it is we can add a comma and a coordinating conjunction. The mayor left town, and the auditor did too. When we make this change, we have to make sure that the meaning of the sentence does not change. We also could just make it into two sentences because we have the ability to do that because we have two independent clauses. The mayor left town, period. The auditor did too. A comma splice is when you connect two or more independent clauses with only a comma. Also, very common thing that people do in writing. The officers were fired and the police chief was too. We can see that comma is between the two independent clauses. But we have the ability to make a quick change by just adding a coordinating conjunction in there. The officers were fired and the police chief was too. Like the last one, we could also make it into two separate sentences if we wanted to. Run-on sentences. A run-on sentence may or may not be grammatically inaccurate, but it usually doesn't work well because unrelated items or unimportant details or extra clauses are added as though the writer didn't know when to stop. It often makes sentences confusing and makes them lack clarity. When we're writing, we often want to stick with shorter sentences and paragraphs to make sure we're keeping the information that belongs together and having information that is not relevant or is connected to another portion of our story. We need to put it with that part. So here's an example. The blind man's seeing eye dog died, and it was a sad occasion, and all the man's friends went to the funeral, then went to the bar and drank to his health and said how unfair it was. Some of the ways we know that something is going to be a run-on sentence is that we have a lot of commas and a lot of coordinating conjunctions to put the different elements together. So we'd be able to split this up easily. The blind man's seeing eye dog died, and it was a sad occasion, period. That's one complete idea. When somebody or something dies, we recognize that it's a sad occasion, so it's easy to group them together. Then we could have the next section. All the man's friends went to the funeral, then went to the bar and drank to his health, period. Then we might want to say, some said how unfair it was, or some of his friends said how unfair it was. But when you see a sentence that's long, has a lot of coordinating conjunctions or commas tossed in, and multiple dependent and independent clauses, that's when we know that's going to be a run-on sentence. Once again, on upcoming quizzes, you may be asked to identify a fragment or a run-on sentence, or to find the differences between something like a fragment, a comma splice, a fuse sentence, and a run-on sentence. So make sure that you're prepared and understand the differences between them, be able to identify them, and of course in your own writing to make sure that you're not using them, or if it's something like a fragment, you're using it effectively. Essential versus non-essential clauses. This is called different things in different books. This is the way that I prefer to call it. I think it makes the most sense. And essential is exactly what it sounds like. The sentence doesn't make sense without the information. So if you have an essential clause, it means that it is critical for the reader to understand its meaning. Versus a non-essential clause, if you took it out, the information would still make sense. The story would still make sense. Often, non-essential clauses are set off by commas, dashes, or parentheses. There's an example here. Sarah, though she had never been to a theme park, preferred the log flume to the Ferris wheel. So even if I took that part in commas out, it still would make sense with what we're trying to say, which is that Sarah preferred the log flume to the Ferris wheel. We can assume she's at some sort of carnival or theme park or is talking about them because that's where log flumes and Ferris wheels are found. Subjects and objects. This is also important to understand when we're building sentences that are grammatically accurate, that are clear and concise. So subjects, this is the part of the sentence or clause that is doing something. Typically, this is your noun, if you will. Objects are the receiver of the action. So it is not the action, because that, of course, is the verb. It is what receives the action. For example, Sarah threw the ball. The ball is our object because it is receiving the action. That versus whom family. That, when referring to a collective noun, an association, business, inanimate objects, animal without a name, etc. So we can see here, the Gap is the brand that is modernizing the boyfriend gene. Who is used when referring to a person or animal with a proper name. Shirley is the mother who sews all the school plays. So we use that when referring to collective nouns and inanimate objects, and who when referring to a person or an animal with a name. Who versus whom. This one is often confused. Who is the subject pronoun? Who is going to the party? Versus whom is the object pronoun. With whom are you going to the party? Typically, if you're using whom, there's another noun or subject inside of the sentence. Plural versus possessive. You'll see a full explanation of this with these examples in your next lecture, so make sure that you understand. But this is just a little review. Plural is multiple. Possessive shows ownership. Make sure that you go through using the correct form of adjectives and adverbs. To form most adverbs, you just add an ly. So quick, that's your positive adjective. If you want to make the positive form of the adverb, you just say quickly. If you want a comparative form of the adverb, you say more quickly or less quickly. Sarah ran more quickly than Jim. Or you could use most or least in front of quickly to make a superlative form of the adverb. Sarah runs the least quickly of the students. You use the comparative and superlatives carefully. A man is the older of the two brothers because there are only two. He is not the oldest of the two brothers, for example. Coordinate adjectives. You should place a comma between coordinate adjectives that are not joined with the word and. You can look up what coordinate adjectives are in your Working with Words books, but they are double adjectives and can be joined with the word and rearranged or both and still work fine. So Sarah is a good role model for June, since June is a talented, smart woman. So we could also rewrite the sentence to say June is a smart, talented woman. Either direction, these adjectives work, which is what makes them coordinate adjectives. And we're able to put an and in between them if we so desire. It was a long, tedious class. It was a tedious, long class. Personally, I like the sound of the first one, but either one works. It was a long and tedious class. Wrong. 3 beautiful cats walked in. Sometimes people think numbers are coordinate adjectives, but they are not, because you cannot say beautiful 3 cats walked in or 3 and beautiful cats walked in. so we just have to be careful. This is just a reminder that your quiz has spelling words, and these are this week's spelling words. They can be found in a link in the module as well at the bottom of the module's page. And the same goes for the vocabulary. In the next lecture, you can also see more about word usage.